Aaron.
We're good? Everybody good?
Yep.
You guys good? Jody, you good?
Great.
All right, welcome to the second installment of South Nassau's Truth in Medicine poll. You might ask the question, what is a hospital doing in the polling business? That would be a good question. South Nassau commissioned today's poll as part of a series of public opinion polls that we're doing this year to better gauge the opinions and attitudes of the people we serve on key public health topics. Too loud? Too loud?
Was it loud for anybody else?
Start over.
You're popping into the mic.
Popping the mic.
Yeah, you can
Sorry.
back up a little bit.
Back up. Is that better?
Sorry, it's out.
All right, we're going to try this again. Welcome to the second installment of South Nassau's Truth in Medicine poll. You might ask, what's a hospital doing in the polling business? South Nassau commissioned today's poll as part of a series of public opinion polls we're doing this year to better gauge the opinions and attitudes of the people we serve on key public health topics, so that we can actually serve them even better by providing information to help them stay healthier and out of the hospital. Today's poll is on the use and abuse of antibiotics. And once again, the results demonstrate that there are common misconceptions and gaps in knowledge that we can help address through better education and public awareness. That's why we're here today. To help us with that, we have two experts here from South Nassau, Dr. Aaron Glatt, the chairman of South Nassau's Department of Medicine, who also is a spokesman for the Infectious Disease Society of America, and Dr. Rob Sharma, South Nassau's chief medical officer. And they'll be providing us with some key insights into this issue. First, a few basics about this South Nassau poll. South Nassau poll was conducted via both landlines and cell phones from February 26 to March 1 with 600 adults, both on Long Island and in New York City. All 5 boroughs were represented. LJR Custom Strategies, a nationally recognized independent polling firm, conducted the poll. They have offices in Washington, D.C. and New Orleans. LJR has conducted more than 2,000 studies for a broad spectrum of healthcare, business, education, cultural, and political clients in almost every state in the country, and it is an independent poll. Full results of the poll can be found on South Nassau's website, and we are streaming live on Facebook. Some of the key findings of the poll include nearly 1/3, 32%, of area residents fail to finish antibiotics that are prescribed to them, leaving them at risk for reinfection or reoccurrence of their illness. Some 12% of respondents admitted to pressuring their physicians for an antibiotic even after their doctors told them that they didn't need one. 10% of the respondents reported using an antibiotic prescribed for someone else, or offering their antibiotics to a family member or a friend who wasn't feeling well. Nearly a quarter, some 24% of the respondents said they simply flush unused antibiotics down the toilet, while 44% throw them in the trash, and some 20% reported having unfinished antibiotics in their homes. Nearly half of the poll respondents were unaware that overuse of antibiotics can lead to the spread of antibiotic resistance known as superbugs. Attitudes also differed along gender, age, and racial lines. For the full poll results, again, you can find them on our website. But now I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Aaron Glatt, who is the chairman of the Department of Medicine, and he's going to give us some additional insights.
Thank you very much. This is an extremely important subject. Antibiotics have been one of the physician's best tools in combating life-threatening infections. People that are alive in the pre-antibiotic era can certainly appreciate the wonders of antibiotics, the tremendous impact it's had on saving millions of lives. People would get infections in the pre-antibiotic era and would unfortunately sometimes pass away from those infections. With the development of sulfa drugs, penicillin, and all the subsequent innovations in antibiotics, literally millions of lives have been saved. And now, unfortunately, we're beginning to consider entering into the post-antibiotic era. which means that we actually now have in the United States and in other parts of the world, real live patients who have infections with bacteria for which there is no antibiotic available that can cure them. And this is a very, very serious problem, a problem that the Centers for Disease Control and Infection has recognized, which the government has recognized and mandated that physicians and hospitals do something about this. So antibiotic prescription is a wonderful blessing that we've been given, but it's a two-sided sword. In fact, many antibiotic prescriptions prescribed by physicians and other healthcare professionals are inappropriate. And this is something that we need to address and are addressing both here at South Nassau and across the country in hospitals to make sure that there is appropriate antimicrobial stewardship, to make sure that antibiotics are being prescribed appropriately by clinicians. This poll focused not so much on inappropriate clinician prescribing, but this poll focused on patients inappropriately taking antibiotics. Antibiotics have to be viewed as dangerous. Inappropriate antibiotics can be fatal, can cause life-threatening infection. By taking an antibiotic, you can develop a very serious infection called Clostridium difficile, which can cause a life-threatening infection. So antibiotics aren't just a wonderful, beautiful medication that can cure it. Antibiotics have the potential, unfortunately, to kill. They can also cause very serious complications. They can cause a lot of adverse side effects and drug reactions. There can be very significant allergic responses to antibiotics, and they can be quite toxic to your wallet as well. And therefore, it's extremely important that patients understand that if your physician does prescribe an antibiotic and it's appropriate, that's a good thing. But when you pressure or ask a physician for an antibiotic that's not necessary, and the physician says it's not necessary, that's something that you should take to heart and realize that that antibiotic is dangerous if you take it. The other major danger, which I've alluded to in talking about the pre and post-antibiotic era, is the development of these superbugs, these highly resistant bacteria that are no longer responsive to either most or in some rare situations all antibiotics. These resistance developments are very difficult for physicians in terms of being able to treat with simple medications as an outpatient. Sometimes the resistance requires an intravenous access to be placed, and to be able to treat this patient, they either need to be in a hospital setting or they need to be on home IV therapy because of the development of resistance. And much more importantly, sometimes there just isn't a good non-toxic drug available anymore, and the medicines that we give you to treat these infections have many side effects. So this is a huge problem in the United States. It's a combination of factors brought about by clinicians using drugs inappropriately, patients taking drugs that they have in their house inappropriately, borrowing antibiotics from somebody else that they have when they shouldn't be taking an antibiotic. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Sharma now to discuss some additional aspects of inappropriate antibiotic taking.
Thank you. It's important to remember that antibiotics are chemicals, and whenever you take any chemical, your body can have a reaction to it. Now, me personally, if I'm going to add a chemical to my body, there better be a good reason for me to be adding chemicals to my body. So, if you have an infection, then it's important to take an antibiotic. But if your infection is not going to respond to an antibiotic, and I'll give you an example, the most common use of antibiotics in the outpatient setting is for what we call upper respiratory infections. So, usually a head cold, maybe a sinus infection, sore throat, that kind of thing. Very common this time of year with allergy season. Distinguishing between an infection and allergy can also be challenging. And people will have symptoms and they'll seek treatment for those symptoms. We all want relief, certainly, but the vast, vast majority, and we're talking 90+% of upper respiratory infections are not due to bacteria that will respond to an antibiotic. So what does that mean? It means if you go to your doctor and you have a good relationship with your doctor, you trust your doctor, and they say it looks like it's a virus, that means you don't pressure for an antibiotic. It means you don't need one. And the likelihood of benefiting from that is zero, but all the side effects that Dr. Glatt just mentioned, you're exposing yourself to all of that. Now, we've seen antibiotics cause allergies. We've seen antibiotics cause other problems. our bodies live in harmony with bacteria. We call those the good bacteria. And those good bacteria are important for a number of functions that we don't even think about, from blood clotting to normal gut intestinal function. When we take antibiotics, it doesn't distinguish between good and bad. It kills whatever bacteria it can get its effect on. So also remember that you're disturbing your own body's balance when you take an antibiotic. And then finally, the last element that's very important is that we also see a lot of liver and kidney injuries that are due to inappropriate antibiotic use. So it's not just the allergies, it's not just the other infections you can get, but your organs are also being affected by this. And it's very important that we consider our whole body when we think about antibiotic usage. So if you have that good relationship with your doctor, they recommend an antibiotic, it's important to take it. It's important to take it as prescribed. It's important to finish it. If they don't recommend it, certainly don't ask, don't pressure. A lot of people say, I'm traveling, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm very busy at work, everything's hectic at life. We think the antibiotic is going to solve that problem for us. You're going to be better in the same amount of time, with or without the antibiotic, if it's a virus, and you're only exposing yourself to unnecessary chemicals. Joe?
Dr. Glad, maybe you just want to review for everyone what people can do other than not asking their physician for antibiotics they don't need. But if you have antibiotics that are left over in your medicine cabinet, what should you do with them? Maybe you can just walk us through the type of antibiotics that we have on display.
So one thing that's very important for people to understand is that if your physician prescribes you an antibiotic, one should really take it for the entire period of time that that's been prescribed for. I will say that there's a lot of new data to suggest that we've been over-prescribing antibiotics. And indications in the past for 14 days or 10 days of therapy have maybe been too long. And it's actually more appropriate to take some antibiotics for 5 days or 7 days. Having said that, the physician should decide how long that antibiotic should be taken. And it is important that patients take it for the entire period of time that your physician has recommended that you take the antibiotic, to make sure that you don't stop it early and, heaven forbid, have a relapse of the disease, or not adequately treat the problem and then come back with a bigger complication. So you shouldn't really have antibiotic left in your medicine chest. You should finish it off. Take it as prescribed for the total duration, and that should have nothing left there for afterwards. If for whatever the reason you do have some pills left, you need to dispose of them properly. You should not flush them down the toilet. You should not leave them out where, heaven forbid, somebody, a child or somebody else may end up taking them inappropriately. But you should dispose of them properly. There are collection places where you can dispose of them. You can return them to the police precincts. There are other ways to appropriately take care of your excess antibiotic. What you should not do is leave it around in case you need it the next time. Unless a physician is telling you to leave some rare indications that a physician will say you need to have an antibiotic available for you in rare situations on an emergency basis, get rid of those antibiotics that you have left over after a prescription that may not have worked for the last disease that you were taking it for. They had to change them. Get rid of them. Do not give them to somebody else. Do not share them with family members or friends.
And that seems like a safe thing to do, to flush them down the toilet. Why wouldn't you flush them down the toilet?
So there's a potential for these antibiotics to actually get into the water systems, get into our environment, and can unfortunately lead to potentially resistance development. The bacteria really don't care where they're exposed to the antibiotic, whether it's in your body or in the environment. And they are smart enough to develop resistance wherever they come into contact with them. And then if a person were to come into contact with those bacteria that have developed resistance, you could get into trouble. I'll give you one specific example. There is an organism called Staph aureus, which 20, 30 years ago, it was almost unheard of for there to be significant levels of resistance to this organism in the community. Today, it's extremely common. This is the infection known as MRSA, M-R-S-A, which is a huge public health concern, which 20, 30 years ago was a rare problem that was seen in only selected hospital patients. And today it's a community problem. Young kids in a wrestling tournament can pick it up from their opponent. And this is a tremendous example of how antibiotic pressure, often inappropriate antibiotic pressure, can lead to the development of these huge public health problems. You've heard of CRE possibly, VRE. These are all alphabet soup names of antibiotics that no longer are effective against certain organisms. So this is a public health crisis that we're facing, and the poll results that we had here from the South Nassau Community Poll really are driving that point home, that we need to better educate both physicians as well as patients on appropriate antibiotic usage. I'm very proud of what we have here at South Nassau, where we have a state-of-the-art antimicrobial stewardship team, which is a combination of some wonderful clinical pharmacists and infectious disease physicians that have literally reviewed over 10,000 prescriptions in the hospital and intervened on those prescriptions with physicians to make sure that we're optimizing patient care here at South Nassau. Now I'll walk you through some of the very common antibiotic that we see problems with in terms of inappropriate prescriptions.
We're just not going to have audio if you.
Go over there.
Yeah.
Okay. You want me to bring them over here?
I guess.
Which one you want, John? Zitromax?
Azithromycin and the Cipro would be the best.
You want to get into the
Two of the commonly misprescribed antibiotics that you see in the outpatient setting are two wonderful drugs. These are drugs that are truly excellent drugs when they're used appropriately, but already have much more limited ability to be used by clinicians because of inappropriate prescriptions as well as inappropriate taking of these medications by patients. And one of them is azithromycin, known as Zithromax, which is a very potent and very good antibiotic that has a very special role in the treatment of certain specific infections. What it does not do, has zero benefit and only potential serious toxicity, is against viral infections in the upper respiratory tract and bacterial infections that are untreated by zithromycin, Zithromax. And therefore, a tremendous amount of inappropriate antibiotic usage, often because of patients' demands for a, quote, Z-Pack, a very effective marketing tool, and a very good antibiotic for those specific indications. But people feel that when they get a cough or they get a little bit of an upper respiratory infection, the treatment of choice is a Z-Pack, and that's 100% absolutely incorrect. It needs to be reserved for very specific indications. A wonderful drug that has unfortunately been misused to a great extent by both clinicians and by patients.
So I got through the winter. I was a little sick. I got a Z-Pack. I didn't finish it. I got a Z-Pack in my medicine cabinet. What am I supposed to do with it?
Bring it to me tomorrow and I'll dispose of it properly.
What should the folks on the South Shore do?
So they should bring it to either their police precinct or to their pharmacy to be disposed of properly. There are collection sites throughout the county. You certainly shouldn't flush it down the toilet, and you shouldn't leave it in your medicine chest. Besides the fact of potential problems with expired medicines, even if it's not expired, there's huge problems with taking it inappropriately. The Z-Pack's a short duration of therapy. If you're supposed to be taking it, you should finish off the entire 5 days of therapy. And it should hopefully, when it's appropriately prescribed, be a wonderful cure for the specific infection that you have, not general upper respiratory infection. In some ways, a more tragic story is the story of the quinolone antibiotics. When these antibiotics came out about 20 years ago, they were felt to be a fantastic new addition to the physician armamentarium, an ability for the first time to really treat some very serious gram-negative rod infections, which, not to get too technical, is a very serious type of infection that we would now be able to treat with an oral antibiotic. And unfortunately, these antibiotics were prescribed like water for many non-appropriate indications. And where this drug was essentially 100% effective against a bacteria called E. coli, which is the most common cause of urinary tract infection in the United States, and where urinary tract infection does need to be treated, it's a painful and potentially very serious infection. So this drug was essentially 100% effective when it first came out. At best, it's only about 50% effective nowadays. And that means that I cannot prescribe this drug, or even this class of drugs, for that type of an infection today, empirically, when I don't know yet whether it's sensitive or resistant. So we've taken an unbelievably good oral agent and essentially made it no longer an option as a first choice of therapy. And sometimes patients will now need to be admitted or given a more toxic, potentially less effective drug as a first-line choice because of the development of resistance to this class of agents. This is why the CDC, the Joint Commission, the United States, have put as a brand new requirement, January 2017, that every hospital in the country establish an antimicrobial stewardship program to address inappropriate antibiotic prescribing. I'm proud to say that the Infectious Disease Society of America, for which I'm a spokesperson, has been at the forefront of this battle for 25 to 30 years. And finally, we're seeing some action. And not only Infectious Disease Society of America is pushing this agenda right now, but everybody is pushing this agenda because we're realizing that we want to practice in the antibiotic era and not practice in the post-antibiotic era.
You talked a little bit about the superbug issue and how overuse of antibiotics can lead to superbugs. The poll found that nearly half of the respondents were unaware that inappropriate use of antibiotics can lead to the development of superbugs. You want to just talk, what is a superbug? And
so superbugs is a little bit of a vernacular term that describes bugs that have developed resistance. I'll give you the best example that I can think of. There's an agent called vancomycin. Vancomycin is a very powerful glycopeptide, a certain type of drug that is very, very good against treating staph infection. When vancomycin was developed, there was no such thing as resistance to vancomycin. Over time, because of so much appropriate as well as inappropriate usage of vancomycin, there became an entity known as vancomycin-resistant enterococci. The enterococcus, which is a very important pathogen in the hospital, has now developed resistance to vancomycin. But the story doesn't end there. There now is something called VDE. That's called vancomycin-dependent enterococci. That means that this bug cannot survive unless it's in the presence of vancomycin. We've gone from a bacteria that was automatically killed by vancomycin to going to where it was resistant to vancomycin, to the development of this unique organism that can only survive if it's in the presence of vancomycin. That's how much the bacteria has mutated. This is a tragic example of inappropriate antibiotic use consequences. We've gone from having a superior drug to having a drug that's totally ineffective and in fact is only damaging patients. And unfortunately, this story can be told for almost every class of antibiotic. So we're really facing a frightening future. There aren't a lot of drugs in the pipeline, and the development of resistant organisms is occurring every day because of antibiotic pressure. And it's our job as clinicians, and especially infectious disease clinicians, to educate other clinicians, to educate the public. I'm so proud of what South Nassau has done here in bringing this issue to the forefront and having this Truth in Medicine poll to educate our community. And thank you all for being here today to help educate the community in proper usage of antibiotics by both clinicians and patients.
with that, do you have any questions? We certainly entertain
So,
any questions.
so the poll shows that the Long Islanders are careless with their antibiotics. Do we have a bigger incidence of superbugs here? What's it like here?
So I think the superbug problem is in every community different. Brooklyn happens to have a very, very significant resistance problem, which they published on nationally, and they've been at the forefront of identifying some of these resistance concerns. Nassau County has its own share of significant problems. I don't think we're an outlier in either having a tremendous amount of resistance or a tremendous amount of lack of resistance. I think we fall probably pretty much smack in the middle of where you'd expect a large urban, suburban community population to be in terms of the resistance platform that we have. We at South Nassau, as do other hospitals, put out a resistance profile for clinicians on a regular basis so they can know the changing milieu of antibiotic resistance. And that's very important. And the CDC is mapping this across the country to try and identify pockets of areas where resistance is more of a concern. You may not treat the same infection in New Orleans as you do in Los Angeles as you do in Nassau County because of resistance pressures and concerns.
And how common is it to find a patient that has some kind of bug that you can't treat?
Thank God, right now it's still very rare to have a patient that has absolutely no antibiotic that can treat their infection. But there are real patients like this in New York. They've been identified across the country already, certainly across the world. And we isolate, quarantine those patients very carefully, and we practice rigorous infection control practices to make sure that we can limit, if not totally alleviate, the spread of these organisms from one person to another person. That's why it's so critical, as an important part of antibiotic stewardship, that we practice rigid infection control, rigorous practicing of washing the hands, the single most important thing to help prevent the spread of resistance once it's already developed. Appropriate isolation of patients. Some patients require contact isolation, other patients require different forms of isolation, and the goal is to mitigate, alleviate, prevent the spread of these organisms once they're identified. The problem is, in the community, they're not identified. They can easily spread through normal person-to-person interaction. And unfortunately, once these bacteria are common enough, it's almost impossible to prevent this spread in the community. Again, the example of MRSA is a classical example of how it spread so quickly in the community from being a pure hospital problem to now it's a community problem.
Dr. Glad, why don't you mention the percentage of patients we see that have one resistant bug or more?
So, depending on the population that we see, for example, patients coming in from the community, from the healthy home environment versus patients coming in from a nursing home or from having recently been hospitalized, you can expect almost all patients who have been recently hospitalized coming in from a nursing home or from another healthcare facility to have some level or aspect of resistant organisms. So it's pretty close to 100% of those patients. On the other hand, patients coming in who haven't really had an exposure to a high likelihood of being exposed to resistant organisms have not been on antibiotics, so that percentage is much lower, but it's not zero. You probably have 10 to 15 to 20% of people in the community nowadays who are otherwise healthy, who have not had the classical risk factors, having some significant resistance expectation when they come into the hospital. What this means is it's changed dramatically the way a physician can treat or empirically treat these infections when they occur. You can no longer use, with a high likelihood of success, certain antibiotics empirically, meaning when you don't yet know the culture results day one when they present to you. And you may have to use a broader agent. And one of the major efforts that we have in stewardship is to de-escalate. That means to downgrade. We had to use a broad agent on day one. Thank God it's worked, and thank God you actually have a more sensitive organism. So the trick at that point is not to say, well, you're doing well, don't touch anything. But the trick is to say, you no longer need the gorillacillin, now we can give you penicillin. Penicillin remains a phenomenal antibiotic where it's effective. So if penicillin still works, it's almost always the treatment of choice. The problem is you can almost never use it empirically anymore because of the concerns for resistance.
Dr. Black, can you please comment, you mentioned antimicrobial stewardship teams. Can you tell me, within hospital settings, who exactly is on those teams and some of the things that they do to help with the endeavors that you're talking about?
Sure, so I mentioned before, it's certainly worthwhile mentioning again, that the antimicrobial stewardship team, for example, here at South Nassau is comprised of some wonderful different clinical skill set physicians and pharmacists who are at the forefront of knowledge in terms of appropriate prescribing. And the first line of defense, if you wish, is a group of very skilled clinical pharmacists. Some of them are doctors of pharmacy, some of them are infectious disease pharmacists, and have expertise specifically in the usage, appropriate usage of antibiotics. And we have a wonderful team here, and they're in the back. You can get hopefully some nice pictures of them afterwards, who are really at the forefront of making sure that we're appropriately caring for patients. they're backed up by infectious disease physicians who have additional expertise and training in the appropriate clinical usage of antimicrobials. And this combination is just a very, very successful, wonderful combination of talents, using the skills of a clinical pharmacist, a doctor of pharmacy, along with the expertise of an infectious disease physician who is not only an internist, but has an additional 2 or 3 years of training in the appropriate usage of antibiotics. This combination is a win for everybody. It's a win for the patients, it's a win for resistance, and it's actually a win for cost, because I always point out that good care is actually a lot less expensive than bad care. And you can eliminate the complications. Patients don't have to stay in the hospital longer. They don't get some of the horrible adverse reactions that you can get from antibiotic inappropriate usage. So this is a win-win for everybody. It's a win for the patient, number one. It's a win for the hospital, and it's a win for the environment and for all patients. The difference between antibiotics and other medications is if you give the wrong antihypertensive to somebody, if you give the wrong blood pressure pill to somebody, you've just hurt that one patient. You haven't hurt anybody else. If I give the wrong antibiotic to somebody, or somebody takes an inappropriate antibiotic, they're not the only ones that are hurt. Everybody is hurt. The entire environment is hurt because of the development of resistance. That's a huge difference between antibiotics and every other type of non-infectious disease medication. You're only affecting one person if they're not taking the right cholesterol medication, if they're not taking the right blood clotting medication. But with antibiotic, you're affecting 300 million people in the United States. That's a very big responsibility for doctors and patients to understand.
So just to sum up, for folks on Facebook, as well as the media, you had to name 1 or 2 things for the public to know, again, most important things they can do to address this issue.
Antibiotics are dangerous. Don't think of them as cure-alls. Only appropriate usage is good. It is very dangerous to take an inappropriate antibiotic. It can hurt you, it can hurt your family, people that you live around, and your community. Don't take something that you haven't been prescribed. If somebody has an antibiotic, it worked for them, it's going to work for you. I had the same cough and it was great. Don't listen to that person. Dispose of your antibiotics properly and only take them as prescribed for the exact amount of time that your physician prescribed them.
Thank you, Joe. Any other questions? Anything else? Okay.
Can we get everybody to spell their names and give titles?
Sure. Dr. Sharma?
Hold on 1 second. Okay.
I'm Dr. Aaron E. Glatt, A-A-R-O-N-E, my middle initial, Glatt, G-L-A-T-T. I'm the chairman of medicine and the hospital epidemiologist, and I'm a spokesperson for the Infectious Disease Society of America.